On the worst day of my life, the day I lost my job and had exactly one meal left to my name, I gave half of it to a freezing, homeless woman on a park bench. I had nothing. I mean that literally. I had been laid off that morning, I had a 6-year-old son waiting at home, and the food in my hands was the last food I could afford until I figured something out. And I sat down next to a shivering stranger that the whole world had walked past all day, and I split my last meal with her, because she looked hungrier than I felt. What I did not know, what I would not find out until weeks later, was that the ragged, starving woman on that bench was one of the richest people in the entire country, and that I was the only person in a city of millions who had stopped. Not the richest people who passed her, not the comfortable ones with full stomachs and full wallets. The one man who stopped for her was the one man on that whole street who had, that very morning, lost nearly everything he had. I've never been able to decide whether that's the saddest part of this story or the most beautiful. Maybe it's both. I'm going to tell you the whole story, who that woman really was, why a billionaire was sitting on a bench pretending to be homeless, and what happened when she found out that the only person who shared with her was a man who had just lost everything. But more than that, this is a story about a thing I've come to believe is one of the truest things in this world, that the people who have the least are almost always the ones who give the most. Before I start, one quick thing, and then I'll let it run. I'm not a man who's good at asking for things, you'll understand why in a minute, so I won't make a big pitch. I'll just say that if you've ever been down to your last and found out what you're really made of, or been surprised by kindness from someone who had no reason to give it, then this story is for you. Stick around to the end, and there's a subscribe button down there if it earns its keep. Now, let me take you to the worst, and, it turned out, the best day of my life. My name is Sal Romano, I'm 39 years old, and at the time this happened I worked at a warehouse, on the floor, moving freight, steady work, nothing glamorous, but it kept a roof over our heads, and I'm raising my boy on my own. My son is named Nico, he's 6 years old, and he is everything I have in this world. His mother, my wife, Gina, passed away 2 years ago, and from the day I lost her, my whole life narrowed down to one single purpose: take care of Nico. Keep him fed, keep him safe, keep him from feeling the hole where his mother used to be. That's it. That's the whole job. Everything I do for that boy. And on the morning this story starts, I lost the means to do it. The warehouse made cuts. A whole shift of us let go, just like that, on a Tuesday morning, with a handshake and a final check that was already mostly spoken for, no warning. I stood in that parking lot holding a cardboard box with my work boots and a photo of Nico in it, and I felt the floor drop out of my life. Because here's the thing about living the way we lived. Paycheck to paycheck, one man and his kid with no cushion, no savings, no family nearby to catch us. There is no margin for a day like that. I did the math right there in the parking lot, and the math was terrifying. I had almost nothing in the bank. Rent was coming. And I had, in my actual pocket, a small handful of dollars that had to feed my son and me until I could find something else, however long that took. I want to try to make you feel what that parking lot felt like, because if you've never been there, I'm not sure I can, and if you have, you already know. It isn't dramatic. Nobody yells. They hand you a box and a check, and somebody you've worked next to for years can't quite meet your eye. And then you're standing in the sun in a parking lot holding everything you own from that building in a cardboard box, and the world keeps going exactly the same as it did 5 minutes ago, except your whole life just quietly caved in. And the thing nobody tells you about is the shame. It floods you. Even when it isn't your fault, even when they cut a whole shift, some animal part of you whispers that you failed, that you couldn't protect your kid, that you're not enough. I stood there thinking about Nico's face, and about Gina, and about how I'd promised her at the end that I'd take care of our boy, and I felt like I was breaking that promise right there in a parking lot on a Tuesday. That's the man I was that afternoon. Not just broke. Ashamed and scared, and carrying a promise to a dead woman that I suddenly didn't know how to keep. So that's the man I was that afternoon. A man who had just lost his job, who was walking the long way home because he couldn't yet face telling his 6-year-old that things were about to get hard, with a few crumpled dollars in his pocket and the whole weight of the world on his chest. On the way home, I stopped at a little corner place, and I spent some of those last few dollars on food. I want to explain why, because it matters. I bought a hot meal, a good one, more than I should have spent, because that night I was going to have to sit Nico down and find some gentle way to tell him that Daddy lost his job, and I could not bear the thought of doing that over nothing. I wanted us to have one good warm meal together first, one normal, happy dinner before the hard times started. It was probably foolish, spending like that when I had so little, but I think any parent understands it. I wanted to give my boy one more good night before the worry came in. That hot meal in my hands was very nearly the last of what I had. You have to understand my Nico to understand why I'd spend my last money on a hot dinner instead of stretching it into 3 days of cheap noodles, which is what the sensible part of me knew I should do. Nico is 6, and he lost his mother at 4, and he is the bravest, sweetest little soul, and he has already had more taken from him than any child should. When Gina died, I watched the lights go dim in that boy for a long while, and I had spent 2 years slowly, carefully coaxing them back on, building him a world that felt safe and warm and steady, where Daddy always had it handled, where there was always dinner and always a bedtime story and always enough. And now I was about to have to crack that world. I was going to have to sit him down and find words to tell a 6-year-old that things were going to be tight, without making him afraid, without making him feel the ground move the way I'd felt it move in that parking lot. And I just could not do that to him over a bowl of cheap noodles. I wanted to give him one more night of the world feeling safe before I had to shake it. So I spent the money. It was, on paper, a foolish thing to do with the last of your cash. But I would do it again every single time, because that boy's sense of safety was the one thing I had left to give him, and I was going to give it to him one more night no matter what it cost. And then I came through the little park that sits between the corner store and our street, and on a bench in the cold was a woman. She was, by every appearance, homeless. Ragged clothes layered up against the cold, a tattered bag beside her. Gray-looking, gaunt, hunched over. She was shivering, really shivering, the deep kind that comes from being cold for a long time, and she had the hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten in a while. She wasn't asking anyone for anything. She was just sitting there, enduring, the way you see people enduring when the world has stopped seeing them. And here's the thing I noticed, the thing I've thought about 1,000 times since. The park wasn't empty. People were walking through it, plenty of them, and a lot of them were doing well for themselves. Nice coats, nice shoes, shopping bags, phones out. And every single one of them walked past that freezing woman like she was a piece of the furniture. Not one slowed down, not one looked at her. She was invisible. A whole stream of comfortable people flowing around her like she was a rock in a river, and not one of them stopped. I watched it for a minute before I moved, and it did something to me. There were people in that park that day who could have fed that woman for a month and never felt it. People carrying shopping bags with single items in them that cost more than my week's groceries. And every one of them had perfected the thing we all do, the little trick of the eyes, where you see a person in need, and you very smoothly look at your phone, or the trees, or the middle distance, anywhere but at them, so you never quite have to know they're there. I'd done it myself, plenty of times, in better days. It's not that people are evil, it's that it's so easy, when you're comfortable, to make a suffering person disappear just by not looking. And the more comfortable you are, the easier it gets, because their world and your world stop touching at all. I think that's the real poverty at the top, if I'm honest. Not a lack of money, a lack of the thing that makes you stop. Those well-dressed people flowing past that bench had everything except the one thing that would have made them slow down, and they didn't even know it was missing. And I stopped. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't because I'm some kind of saint. It was almost the opposite. It was because that very day, I had just gotten a hard, fresh lesson in how fast a person can fall. That morning, I'd had a job. By afternoon, I had a box of boots and a countdown clock on my whole life, and I looked at that freezing woman, and instead of seeing someone separate from me, someone to step around, I saw someone who was maybe just a few bad Tuesdays further down the same road I'd just started walking. I thought, that could be me. That could be me a year from now, if it all goes wrong. And I physically could not, walk past somebody that hungry and that cold while I was holding a hot meal in my hands, even if it was my last one. And I'll tell you the other thing that was working on me, the thing I didn't say out loud to anyone for a long time. It was Gina. My wife, near the end, when she was sick and frightened, what she was most afraid of wasn't dying. It was being forgotten, being a burden, being looked through. She used to say the cruelest thing about being sick was how some people stopped seeing you as a person. And here was this woman on a bench, cold and hungry, and looked through by the whole world. And something in me that still belonged to Gina simply would not let me add one more person to the long line of people walking past her. I knew, in my own body, what it costs a human being to be invisible. I'd watched it nearly break the woman I loved. So no, I couldn't walk by. Not that day, not holding a hot meal, not as the man Gina had loved. Some part of me was honoring my wife by sitting down on that bench, though I couldn't have put it into words at the time. I just knew my feet stopped walking, and I sat down. So I sat down next to her on that cold bench. And she looked over at me, wary, the way people get when they're used to being either ignored or hassled. And I didn't make a big thing of it. I just opened up that hot meal I'd bought for me and Nico, and I split it, right there, into 2 halves, and I held one out to her, and I said something like, "It's cold out. You should eat something. It's good. It's still hot." And she stared at me. For a long second she just stared, like she couldn't process what was happening. And then she took it, with hands that were genuinely shaking, and she ate. And I ate the other half next to her, and we sat there together in the cold and just ate. 2 strangers on a bench, and I didn't ask her any questions and I didn't preach at her. I just sat with her so she wouldn't be eating alone, because I've learned that sometimes being alone is the hungriest part. That's a thing grief teaches you, if nothing else does. After Gina died, the hardest part of a lot of days wasn't the big sadness. It was the small loneliness of eating dinner across from an empty chair, of having no one to hand half your meal to. So I've never been able to see a person eating alone, really alone, the lonely on the inside kind, without wanting to sit down across from them. It costs you nothing, sitting with someone. You don't have to fix their life or solve their problems or even say very much. You just have to be a second human being in the space, so the food doesn't go down in silence. I think half of what I gave that woman on the bench wasn't the meal at all. It was the company. It was the simple message, sent by sitting down, that said, "You are not invisible to me. I see you, you're a person, and you and I are going to sit here in the cold and eat together like 2 people, because that's what you are, a person, and so am I." The food was the smaller half of the gift, honestly. The bench, and the not being alone, was the bigger one. And as we sat there, we talked a little, quietly. And there was something about her, even then, ragged and freezing as she was, something in the way she spoke, a kind of sharpness underneath that didn't quite fit the clothes. But I didn't think much of it. People end up on benches from all kinds of lives, and at one point she asked me, looking at my face, why I'd stopped when no one else had, and whether I had a lot to spare. And I laughed, I remember, kind of a sad laugh, and I told her the truth. I said, "Spare? No, ma'am. Truth is, I lost my job this morning. This was about the last of my money. I got a little boy at home I got to figure out how to feed." And she looked at me, really looked at me, and she got very quiet. And she said, "Then why on earth would you give half of it to me?" And I said the thing that I believe with my whole heart, the thing my own mother taught me growing up when we had nothing either. I said, "Because you needed it more than me right now. And because when you've got next to nothing, that's exactly when you find out if you're really going to share or not. Anybody can give when they've got plenty. My mom used to say it's the people with empty pockets who keep this whole world from freezing over." She didn't say anything to that, but I saw her eyes fill up, and I figured it was just the kindness, the surprise of being treated like a person. I had no idea I'd just said something that was going to take that woman apart. Looking back, I understand now exactly why those particular words landed on her like they did, though I had no way of knowing it on the bench. Here was a woman who had spent the entire day collecting evidence that people are selfish, that no one gives, that the world is cold all the way down, and she was close to believing it for good. And then a man who'd lost his job that morning handed her half his last meal and told her, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, that it's the people with empty pockets who keep the whole world from freezing over. I wasn't trying to teach her anything. I was just saying what I believed, the thing my mother had drilled into me over a lot of thin dinners when I was a boy. But to a billionaire on the edge of giving up on the human race, sitting cold and hungry and invisible, it must have been like hearing the one argument against everything she'd concluded that day, delivered by the one person with the standing to make it. A man with nothing, giving anyway. No wonder her eyes filled up. I'd accidentally answered the exact question her whole, strange experiment had been asking. We finished eating. I gave her the little bit of cash I had left in my pocket, too. It wasn't much, a few dollars, but I gave it to her, told her to get something warm, and then I had to get home to my boy. And I stood up and I told her to take care of herself and to try to get somewhere warm for the night. And she looked up at me from that bench and she said, "What's your name?" And I told her, "Sal." And she said, "Thank you, Sal. You have no idea what you've done." And I figured she just meant the meal. I smiled and I said it was nothing, and I walked home to go break my heart telling my son the bad news. And that, I thought, was the end of it. A small kindness on a bad day, the kind that disappears the second it's over. I went home. I made the best of that night with Nico. I started the grim work of looking for a job. I honestly never expected to think about the woman on the bench again. Now, let me tell you who she actually was. Her name was Eleanor, I'll leave the rest of it off, and she was a billionaire. Not a millionaire. A billionaire. One of the wealthiest, most powerful business figures in the entire country, the head of an enormous company, a name that people who follow such things would know instantly. And she had not been homeless. She had been in disguise. Here's the story, the one she told me later. Eleanor had spent her whole life building her empire, and somewhere along the way, way up at the top of it, she had lost touch completely with the actual world, with regular people, with what life is really like down on the ground for the millions of people who, in one way or another, worked for her or were affected by her decisions. She was about to make some enormous decision about her company, cuts, restructuring, the kind of thing decided in a boardroom that lands on thousands of real lives, and something in her had rebelled against making it from inside her bubble. She told me she'd had a kind of crisis, a hollow feeling that she'd built this giant thing and had no idea anymore what it was like to be an ordinary person it might crush. And so she had done something drastic and strange. She had dressed herself in rags, left the money and the phone and the assistants behind, and spent one full day out in the city as an invisible, penniless, homeless woman, just to feel it. Just to see how the world treats you when you have nothing. Just to remember, or maybe to learn for the first time, what it's like down where her decisions actually land. And she told me it had been the most devastating day of her life. Because she had spent that entire day being treated like she did not exist. She, a woman accustomed to every door opening, every person attentive, the whole world arranging itself around her wealth. She spent a day discovering what the world looks like when you have nothing, and the answer was that the world looks straight through you. All day, she said, people had ignored her, avoided her, stepped around her, refused to meet her eyes. Hundreds of people. Comfortable, well-off people, the very kind she'd spent her life among. Not one of them had treated her like a human being. She said she had sat on that bench, genuinely cold and genuinely hungry by then, having not eaten all day, feeling more alone and more invisible than she had ever felt in her gilded life, and she had thought to herself, "This is what I really am to the world, underneath the money. Nothing. This is how much people actually care about each other. None at all." She told me about specific moments from that day that had cut her to the bone, and they were small, ordinary cruelties, the kind that get aimed at the poor 1,000 times a day without anyone even noticing. A coffee shop where she'd gone in just to get warm and been asked to leave because she wasn't buying anything, in a tone she said she had never once in her life been spoken to in. A woman who'd pulled her child to the other side of the sidewalk, eyes full of distaste, as if Eleanor were something dirty. Hours of people's eyes sliding off her like she was a smudge on the window of their day. She said the most frightening part was how fast it worked on her own mind. How, after only a few hours of being treated like nothing, she had started to feel like nothing, started to hunch, to avoid people's eyes before they could avoid hers, to believe the verdict the world was handing down. In a single day. She said she finally understood something that had been invisible to her from the top of her tower, that being poor isn't just about lacking money, it's about being slowly erased, every day by 1,000 people who've decided you don't count. And she'd built a life, she realized, sitting on that bench, that erased people like that by the 1,000, and she'd never once felt it, until the day she wore the rags herself. And she had been on the very edge, she told me, of concluding something terrible, that people are fundamentally cold and selfish, that kindness is a fairy tale, that everybody is exactly as alone as she felt on that bench. And then a man sat down next to her. A man who, she would learn in about 10 minutes, had himself lost his job that very morning and was holding the last of his food. And that man split his last meal in half and handed it to her, and gave her his last few dollars, and sat with her so she wouldn't eat alone, and told her that it's the people with empty pockets who keep the whole world from freezing over. She told me later that I broke her heart wide open on that bench, that after a full day of being looked through by the wealthy, the only person in the entire city who had stopped, who had seen her, who had shared, was a man who had nothing left to share. That the one act of kindness she received in her whole experiment came from the one person who could least afford to give it. She said she sat on that bench after I walked away and she wept harder than she had in years, because in the middle of proving to herself that the world was cold, a broke, grieving single dad had reached over and proven the exact opposite, and had no idea he was doing it, and wanted nothing in return. Now, let me tell you what she did. Because this is where my life changed. I didn't hear anything for a few weeks. I was deep in it by then, applying for everything, stretching every dollar, lying awake doing the math the way you do when the ground's gone out from under you. And then one day I got a phone call from an assistant from a company, a big company, asking me to come in, and I figured it was just a job application, coming through, one of the dozens I'd thrown out into the void, and I put on my one good shirt and I went. And I was shown into an office at the top of a tower, and behind the desk was a sharply dressed, powerful woman I had never seen before in my life, except I had. Because when she stood up and looked at me, I knew those eyes. It was her. The woman from the bench, cleaned up, in a suit that probably cost more than a year of my old salary, standing in an office in the sky, and I just stood there with my mouth open, completely unable to understand what I was looking at. It is a strange, vertiginous thing to have two completely separate pictures of a person slammed together into one. For weeks, the woman on the bench had lived in my memory as this fragile, freezing, forgotten soul I'd worried about, hoped was somewhere warm, figured I'd never know the fate of. And here she was, the most powerful person I had ever stood in a room with, in a suit, behind a desk the size of my old bedroom, with a view of the whole city behind her. My brain genuinely could not hold both at once. I kept looking for the homeless woman in the billionaire's face, and finding her, in the eyes, and then losing her again in the tailored suit. And the thing I felt underneath the shock surprised me. It wasn't excitement that a rich woman knew my name. It was something closer to grief, oddly, because I realized that the cold, hungry woman I'd sat with, the one I'd felt such tenderness and worry for, had in a sense never existed, and yet she also completely had, because whatever the clothes, a real human being had sat shivering on that bench, and a real human being had been moved to tears by half a meal. The disguise was fake. What passed between us was not. That, I think, is why it worked on us both so deeply. Stripped of everything, we'd met each other as just two people, which is a thing her money usually made impossible. And Eleanor came around that desk, and this powerful woman took both my hands, and she told me everything. The disguise, the experiment, the day of being invisible, and what it had meant, at the lowest moment of it, to have one person stop. She told me she had spent considerable effort tracking me down. She only had a first name and a face and a neighborhood, because she could not let what I'd done go unanswered. And then she offered me a job, not a handout. She was very careful about that, because she'd come to understand, from that one day, exactly how much a man's dignity matters. She offered me a real job, a good one, in her organization. Steady, well paid, with security and benefits. The kind of position that would let me raise Nico without lying awake doing terrible math. The kind of stable footing I'd lost in that parking lot and was terrified I'd never find again. She told me, "I'm not giving you this because I feel sorry for you. I'm giving it to you because on the worst day of your life, with nothing left, you showed me exactly the kind of character I have spent 20 years and a fortune failing to find in people who have everything. I would be a fool not to want a man like that working for me." I took the job, of course I took the job, and it gave my son and me our life back, solid ground, a future, the ability for me to be the father I needed to be without the constant terror of the next bill. She gave me back the one thing I'd lost in that parking lot, which was the ability to take care of my boy. I never did have to give Nico the hard talk the way I dreaded it. Oh, I told him I'd changed jobs, and that for a little while things had been tight because I don't believe in lying to that boy. But I got to tell it to him as a story that had already turned out all right, sitting on solid ground, which is a very different thing from telling a scared child the floor is falling while you're still falling through it. And there's a thing I did that I'll carry to my own grave. The first proper paycheck from the new job, I took Nico back to that same little corner place, and I bought us the same hot meal I'd bought the day I lost everything, and I took him to that same park, and we ate it on a bench, maybe even the same bench I like to think it was, and I told him, in the simple way you tell a 6-year-old true things, that once on this very bench Daddy shared his dinner with a cold, hungry stranger when we had almost nothing, and that it had turned out to be the best thing Daddy ever did. I wanted that lesson in him early, before the world teaches kids to hold tight and look away. I wanted my son to know, in his bones, that you give especially when it's hard, and that you never know who you're really sitting next to. He's 6. I don't know how much of it landed, but he still talks about the bench, so maybe some of it did. And she didn't do it as charity. She did it because she'd seen with her own eyes who I was when I had nothing. There's a world of difference between those two things, and she understood it completely. And I need to underline that, because it was the whole reason I could accept it with my head up. If she had offered me money, a check, a gift, charity, I think something in me would have curled up and died a little, even taking it, because a man who's just failed to keep his job and his promise does not want to be a charity case in front of the memory of his late wife. But she didn't offer me pity, she offered me work. She told me, plainly, that she had watched people with every advantage reveal themselves to be small and grasping, and watched a man with nothing reveal himself to be the opposite, and that as a businesswoman she would be a fool to hand that kind of character a handout instead of a position. She made it about what I could do, not what I lacked. She gave me a way to earn my son's future back with my own 2 hands, which is the only way I ever wanted it. That's the difference between charity and dignity, and I have thought about it every day since. Charity makes a man smaller, and the right kind of help makes him whole. She knew which one she was giving, and she gave it on purpose because one cold day on a bench had taught her exactly how much a person's dignity is worth. But here's the part that matters even more than my job, the part I think about most. Because that day on the bench didn't just change my life. It changed hers, and through her it changed a lot of other lives too. That experiment, that day of being invisible, and the one act of kindness that broke through it, changed how Eleanor saw everything. She told me she had walked back into her life and looked at her company and her thousands of employees, and the decision she'd been about to make completely differently. She'd been about to do the cold, efficient boardroom thing. Instead, she scrapped it and rethought the whole approach, with a single question in her mind that she said she'd gotten from a man on a bench. What happens to the actual human beings down where this lands? She changed policies. She changed how the lowest paid people in her company were treated and paid. She told me, point blank, that a broke single dad sharing his last meal had done more to change how she ran her empire than any consultant or board member ever had. She walked me through it once, what she'd changed, and I won't pretend I understood all the business of it, but the heart of it I understood completely. She'd been about to make cuts that would have done to thousands of families exactly what had been done to mine in that parking lot. The box, the handshake, the floor dropping out. And she said that after that day, she literally could not sign it, because she could no longer not see the parking lots, the kitchen tables, the 6-year-olds who'd be told that things were going to get hard. The abstraction was gone. Every number on the page had become a person on a bench. So she found another way, harder for the company, better for the people, and she changed how the lowest paid workers were paid and treated, put in protections, the kind of thing that doesn't make headlines but